This is Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 for the PlayStation 2. And this is Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 for the GameCube. Can you tell the difference? Ahoy there! Welcome back to more Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2. This time, we're going to find out why the hell this game has two separate versions made by two separate developers, while also figuring out which version is better. Oh, who am I kidding? The PlayStation 2 version is already the clear-cut victor. Just look at the footage between the two. Okay. Let's give the other version a fair shot here. By 2002, when Hot Pursuit 2 came out, EA Seattle and EA Canada were in charge of the Need for Speed series. When EA was making Hot Pursuit 2, their top priority was the PlayStation 2 version. EA Seattle were in charge of the multi-platform version of the game for the PC, Xbox, and GameCube, while a Canadian studio called Black Box handled the PS2 version. Prior to working on Need for Speed, they broke in their racing shoes by developing NASCAR 2001 on PS1 for EA. It was a sign of things to come when they were given the task of making the PS2 version of Hot Pursuit 2. Since the PS2 had high priority, likely due to it beating the GameCube and Xbox to market by a whole year, the Black Box version got better treatment than the EA Seattle version. Alright, let's try to approach this from a fresh perspective. It's 2002, and Hot Pursuit 2 just came out, and I'm a reviewer that bought up all versions of the game. After spending time playing both the Black Box and Seattle versions of the game, I put together a comparison of the two versions. We'll be comparing the game based on these factors: graphics, sound, controls, and gameplay. Hot Pursuit 2 was a step up from the last Need for Speed game, Porsche Unleashed, clearly looking a generation ahead. The Seattle version, however, still looks dated even today. The environments look flat and somewhat cartoonish at times. The same tracks on the PS2 version look like they're from a completely different game due to the increased detail and better textures. Vehicles look identical in both versions of the game, but the Seattle version's cars look less realistic due to how springy the suspension looks. With the PS2 version, car suspension isn't as springy, making the cars look more grounded in reality. One advantage the Seattle version has in graphics is car reflections. It seems to use a render-to-texture method that reflects everything in real time at a lower resolution. This means you can see cars and other objects in the car's reflection. We don't even get stuff like this in modern racing games without ray tracing. The PS2 version must be using spherical maps or something, since PS2 didn't natively support cube maps. Notice how the car reflection judders a bit. Another advantage the Seattle version has is frame rate. Disclosure, I'm not able to demonstrate the Seattle version's frame rate on real hardware, so I'm going based on how it's emulated in Dolphin, and because the PC version likely won't run on Windows 11 without some trickery. The Seattle version targets 60 FPS during gameplay, but I seem to be having some frame pacing issues with Dolphin. Maybe it has that kind of slowdown on real hardware, but I don't know. The PS2 version runs at 60 FPS in menus, but is locked to 30 FPS during races. It's down to 30 FPS to mask some technical shortcomings on PS2, as evidenced by the slowdown that crops up with full car grids and the smoky section of coastal parklands, with a wildfire going on. Okay, I'm kinda cheating by running a 60 FPS patch in PCSX2 and using ReShade for both versions, so both games look more like this in motion. But even on real hardware, the PS2 version still looks great today, and much better than the Seattle version. Similar brushstrokes were used between EA Seattle and Black Box, but the PS2 version is almost a completely different game in the graphics department. Score 1 for the PS2. In the audio department, it's a close one on first inspection. The soundtracks are identical, as is the police chatter. But listen closely and you start to hear distinct differences between the two versions again. Sure, there's the regular and instrumental songs, but the PS2 version gives you more freedom to pick when, where, and if a song appears. You don't get those liberties in the Seattle version, only having the option to lower the music volume. Worst case scenario, you have to turn off the music entirely because of copyright on YouTube. In terms of engine noises, well, it's an early 6th generation racing game, so that means no engine noise will sound completely like the real thing. However, the PS2 version's sounds are more consistent. Listen. Don't you think the engine sounds are better on PS2? Moving on, the main menu sound effects are similar to each other, but the Seattle version has some slightly different UI sounds. Now, I initially thought the showcase voiceovers weren't in the PS2 version, but, silly me, I had to hit the square button to access them. It's nice to hear resident Need for Speed voice of God Jim Conrad read off information about cars in his suave voice.
The Ferrari F50. Its 6-speed transmission is attached to an engine that generates an incredible 513 horsepower at 8,500 RPMs. This combination nets a top speed of over 200 miles per hour.
Same for the track descriptions, where I again thought only the Seattle version had narration by someone that sounds like Jules DeYoung. Not only do both versions have the track description, but it's not Jules DeYoung since her name isn't in the credits. Maybe she wasn't credited.
This track features the largest change in elevation. Journey from the flat downtown area to the top of the tallest mountain on the island. Dealing with the tight turns of the mountainous ascent and descent is the key to mastering this course. Speeds are high in very few sections of this track, and the shortcuts are difficult to master.
Police banner during races are similar enough, but the PS2 version exclusively has an unnamed police sergeant, Unit 9, who acts as a supervisor when a pursuit inevitably gets more intense.
9 all units, give me an update.
Police chatter overall is more dynamic and cinematic in the PS2 version. Really, the sound effects in races are much more cinematic in the PS2 version. It's almost like Black Box recorded some sound effects on their own for things like nitro barrel explosions. The Seattle version uses a stock sound. Another point for the PS2 version, since it has overall better sound quality on top of the fantastic soundtrack and return of voice of God Jim Conrad.
9 all units, get the barricades up.
So far, the Black Box version has jumped ahead, but when we get to how each game controls, things get interesting. By controls, I mean how the core driving mechanics mesh with the controller and how cars handle. Surprisingly, I've taken preference to the Seattle version this time. Being a racing game that doesn't strive for realism, the Seattle version feels more like an arcade racing game. With the PS2 version, you have to rely on braking even more than the Seattle version going full speed ahead. Granted, you still have to hit the brake going into sharp corners, but the Seattle version's handling is tighter and slightly more forgiving. I said slightly. But trying out all the faster cars in the PS2 version for this comparison, they do handle as well as all of the Seattle version's cars. Handbraking, however, is needed to negotiate the tighter turns in faster cars. You can handbrake in the Seattle version, but do you really need to? But the Black Box version has the edge in one way the Seattle version doesn't, at least on GameCube. Using the right stick for the gas and the brake. This is personal preference, but using cross to accelerate and square to brake wears out my thumb in any PS2 racing game. I can tolerate it with Burnout 3 since I don't need to brake often in that game, but anything else makes my thumb joints sore and tender. Plus, using the thumbstick gives me more control over how much gas or brake to give the car since emulators can't take advantage of the DualShock 2's pressure-sensitive buttons, and because no one liked them anyway. While I prefer the controller configuration of the PS2 version, I like the Seattle version's more arcade-like handling. EA Seattle is on the board! At its core, Hot Pursuit 2 is the same as its predecessors Need for Speed 3, Hot Pursuit, and High Stakes. You're driving exotic cars around the world and trying not to get busted by the cops. But with the two different versions of the game, they are two different experiences. The EA Seattle version is a continuation of the classic Need for Speed games, utilizing Eagle, or the EA graphics library. Looking back now, both Hot Pursuit 2 and Porsche Unleashed look eerily similar to each other. Cops still jump at the chance to catch you and ruin your race, but they behave like the cops of 90s era NFS games, in which they will break off pursuit if you get far enough away.
31 counting. I've lost sight of them.
Beating the cops is overall easier since you can escape them and despawn them. And I also forgot to mention this in controls, exploiting the reset button. But if a cop does get close to you, likely from floaty physics causing you to spiral out of control, you can't reset. Despite the overall difficulty being easier, opponents rubber band and you get busted if you're caught once. Only one chance to not screw up your race.
You're busted.
27 county.
I've stopped the Dodge Viper GTS.
I didn't feel super excited by the cop chases in this game, even when things inevitably escalated. However, when we get to the black box version... Now that looks more exciting, don't you think? Based on information online about this game, it also uses Eagle. The version of Eagle that Black Box used would be later used for Underground, and I make that connection due to the traffic car models in the game. They're the same across this game and the two Underground games. Once again, it's similar brushstrokes for a completely different painting. When the police start chasing you, the race becomes more of an event, like a blockbuster Hollywood film. It's much more cinematic than the previous NFS titles. These cops put up a considerably bigger fight than the Seattle version. They try to pit you at every chance, they swerve when ahead to try and cut you off, and they can't be outrun, even if catch-up is disabled. You'll only lose these cops through either persistence or aggression. Because you can't run from the long arm of the law, the helicopter is a much bigger threat. You're much more likely to run into its traps, and the game will tell you if you screwed up.
28-9. The suspect is blasted through the roadblock.
Thankfully, the developers showed mercy by giving you 3 strikes. They knew these cops wouldn't hold back and decided to give players a safety net, but if you are caught, you better have good luck in stopping the other racers from rubber banding and overtaking you. With the Seattle version, its safety net was the reset button. There is no such button bound to the controller in the PS2 version. Don't screw up!
54 count. Commencing pursuit. Vehicle is a yellow Lamborghini Diablo.
County over.
I've got your back. 54-9. Roadblock set.
With how intense the police chases get, the PS2 version is overall more fun and exciting to play.
The winner!
Unsurprisingly, Black Box's version of Hot Pursuit 2 was the winner. It's a better looker and player than the Seattle version, plus the cop chases are the highlight of the PS2 version. The police are about as threatening as a housefly in the Seattle version. It's no wonder the Black Box version became the template for the next 9 years of Need for Speed. Black Box were bought by EA shortly after the game's release, and became the lead developer of NFS games, although it went downhill after Carbon. EA Seattle ceased to be after this game. A bittersweet ending. What are your thoughts on Hot Pursuit 2? Did you play both versions? Do you agree or disagree with what I've said in this video? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, this is Squiddy the Kid saying, don't screw up!